The next speaker will take us from Spain to Germany. We're going to receive Hannah Monderkap, Head of Audience Development of the Rheinische Post. Hannah will take us behind the scenes of the Listening Center, an award-winning research tool created at the Rheinische Post that helped the news organizations to increase the number of subscribers. So welcome, Hannah. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me at News Impact Summit. As already said, I'm head of audience development at Rheinische Post, and you can reach me on Twitter at Monderkamp and also my email. And just a bit about Rheinische Post so that you can see my background. Our main distribution area is North Rhine-Westphalia, and the newspaper itself was founded about 75 years ago, and about 250 journalists. And 24 years ago, RP Online started our online platform, and this was quite early in Germany, so we went online before a lot of news portals, which still helps us a lot with Google ranking. And we have about 50 Facebook pages. And on the map, you can see both our main strength, but also our main challenge, because as you can see, we have a lot of local offices on the map, which still cover exclusive content right where people live. But because our team, as you can see at the arrow, is located in Düsseldorf, that's also the main challenge, because we as audience development are kind of an in-house consultancy that is responsible for all those different offices and supports them with their digital strategy right out of Düsseldorf. And so what I'm going to talk about is that I think in recent years, journalists have learned to communicate with users on eye level. Before that, it was kind of, I wouldn't say arrogant, but journalists decided for themselves what kind of agenda to set, what kind of topics to cover. And there wasn't really much feedback on it. But then with more data and more analysis, you got more feedback. But I think today we have to go even one step further and develop a kind of special empathy to really know what our readers and our users need. Every editor has their offline filter bubbles. They have the same way to work. They have the same people they talk to. They have the same contact persons. And at the same time, they have the same online filter bubbles, the people they follow on Twitter, the pages the algorithm shows them. So we thought that which is obviously fine, because you're a human being and you can only take in so much information, but we thought as Rheinische Post we needed some kind of technology to help us break out of those filter bubbles and to stay relevant with our users, and to maybe identify new topics, identify new targets groups that we didn't see in our filter bubbles. So that's why we introduced the Listening Center. And that was a tool that beforehand had only been used for marketing, like brands could see how people talked about their products, or they could get alerts on different things. But we were the first media company, at least in Germany, who used this technology to see what people online, especially on a local level, would talk about. So we put in hundreds of different keywords. You can see on the left, like Düsseldorf in its different writings, names of celebrities, names of politicians. We put in company names, which are the really specific keywords, but we also put in really generic ones like politics, right-wing, left-wing party, and then combined with the local keywords, and then the tool would search the whole web, which was really important for us, that it didn't only cover social media, but it covered different media, it covered YouTube, it covered comment sections, and then there's different ways to look at the data in real time. As an example here, you can see one out of hundreds of queries for Düsseldorf celebrities, which is knowledge that was already there because obviously our local offices knew the celebrities in their area. They had different lists in different contexts, but there was just a different way to translate it with those operators, which are or, and also and not. And this was also a great challenge because, obviously you don't want to have every job alert, you don't want to have every press release. So we had to filter those results in a way that it was data that was helpful for our editors. And there's different ways to access the data. You have the live dashboard. This is for Town Düsseldorf again, and it's mainly used by our team when there's big news events, like, for example, an election or anything big going on, so that we can have a look at it while it happens. And you can see the mentions over time. So you see when something peaks. You have a sentiment analysis, so it looks at whether a mention is negative, neutral, or positive. And this is obviously, especially in German, this is not always perfect. Like it's not correct with every mention, but when you know the normal average, you can kind of see when you have sentiment over time, you can see when there's a change. And you will also see the media segments. And it's also a good way to identify influencers in your region because you can see who publishes most on a topic. And you can also see the keyword cloud, so what kind of words are commonly used. And this is also an interesting analysis that we did. We just had a look at what kind of topics are mostly spoken about in every town in our area, and also changing on the months. So whether it's football or it's politics or like crime happening in the area. And then which is most important for us, were the mentions that you can either sort by virality, so the viral one is at the top, or chronologic. And then when you click on it, you get right into the original source. So this was the live dashboard, but for us, even more important was the mail reporting, and they are sent out every day automatically. So every editor in our company gets their own reporting based on the topics they're covering, their politics ones, their celebrity ones, and then before the conferences, they can read those reportings and prepare themselves and see what people are talking about. And obviously this is not the main ground of decision. There are other factors, but it's just another tool that shows them maybe something that they haven't heard about, or just new aspects to it, what people online say. And we just, we found out that this is a great way to access online media, because you don't have to deal with how do I set up my profile, who do I follow, how do algorithms work, but you get confronted with it through the topics that you're really familiar with. So that's why older politics editors ended up covering Twitter at our company, which was a really great development. And also in the reporting, you can also have those quantitative analysis. For example, we had a look at how many people talk about each party. And this was really interesting because in the end, this data was really similar to the final election results, which, if you think about it, doesn't really make sense, because not only when there are a lot of people talking about a party, that doesn't directly mean that it's going to be elected, but in this case it worked. So this might be a different way to look at this data. And so there were different cases that came out of those reportings. One of the first ones we had was this one, and this is about the German right-wing party, which is really kind of scattered and divided in Germany. So it's really hard to keep track of what is happening with their internal struggle. and when you're outside that filter bubble. But in that case, it was some right-wing blog. They said that some members of the party wanted to get rid of their co-leader, and we were through that too. We were the first, the first media company that heard of it, and so we covered it right away, and then made a news agency out of it, and then the other media covered it as well and cited us. And this was really great that this happened right at the beginning, so that we could say, see, our listening center, it actually does work. And it also shows that this kind of technology doesn't take away basic journalist skills, because obviously you still have to have contacts at the party, you still have to call them and get it verified, but you might get the information a bit earlier. Another case that is a really nice example is this photo of a British soldier, and it was a really small village in our area, and one day there was a viral mention in the reporting that said Daily Mail, and of course you click on it right away because you're wondering why is your village coming up in the Daily Mail, and this was actually an article on a book by a photographer who had recolored photos from the war, and some photos were from our area, so we managed to contact the author quite quickly and show those photos, which is obviously really interesting to the people in that area. And this is a great example how we had a topic that we usually wouldn't have found out about, because obviously not every editor in our region reads the Daily Mail every day. Another case is when Germania Airlines, a big airline company, went bankrupt. Obviously that's the kind of economic touch to it, but always, like when you have this kind of really hard topic, you want to have kind of the human aspect to it, which is more interesting to our readers. So we just took our queries for Düsseldorf and just searched for Germania, and we had this tweet about how underprivileged children wanted to go to a football game, but they couldn't anymore because the airline had gone bankrupt. And we covered this, and there was a lot of sympathy with it. And then people started donating, and in the end, enough money was raised so that those kids could still go to the football game, which is of course a more emotional story than just that this airline went bankrupt. And another nice example is this boy band from China, which we found out has a big fan group in Düsseldorf. And we actually managed to get the first interview in German with them. So we reached a really special kind of audience. And in the end, we also published this article in English, which got a lot of attention because I usually don't talk to Western media, and which was also quite funny, which you see in the tweet on the right, that they showed the article on TV with our newspaper in it. And another good thing that came out of the listening center was that we kind of showed the tool to other media companies and showed how it had helped us. And because we had already gathered so much data and so much knowledge on it, we helped other media companies implement this tool. So, for example, BR, which is the public media in Bavaria, they now have also introduced the listening center. And this is the first time that a business case kind of came out of the editorial team. So you can see how technology also changes the way how business models are developed. And this changed how this showed how we managed to change our workflow in creating stories and in reaching new audiences. But just now, as a lot of other media companies, we're at the point where obviously we also want to reach new subscribers and paying readers. So we needed to also use data and develop a different kind of empathy to use it and get paying subscribers. and I'm going to talk about how this process went on. So firstly, we set up a subscription project team, and this was the first time that sales and the editorial team sat in the same room, which obviously used to be a big taboo, but this wasn't, of course, to influence each other, but to share data and to set up strategies to reach new audiences, and also to talk with database team to get the right data, and traffic management to get the right technology to get this set up. And the first that came out of it was this editorial dashboard. And I know it might not be too fancy, like it's a basic Google Analytics dashboard, but for us it was a breakthrough because it meant that for the first time, every editor in every local office had access to real-time data on how their articles were converting, what kind of articles worked well with reach, what kind of articles worked well with which converted to subscriptions, and also they could see what articles were read by already paying users. So they managed to develop a different kind of empathy to see what our readers really wanted, and found out that, of course, service content did really, really well, and analysis and topics about traffic, and so changed the way they produce different stories. And another example I'm going to show you, because it's a specific topic where we changed our whole process based on data, is football, or the sports team. You can see going up, you can see the page impressions, and to the right you can see subscriptions, and then you have the big two football teams in our area, Borussia and Fortuna, and then Bundesliga, which is football in general, other sports and other football teams, and you can see that both Borussia and Fortuna are doing really well when it comes to page impressions and subscriptions. Those other topics are not doing too well on both. So that's why we decided to actually use this data and change our whole sports team in general. So what used to be a big sports team has now been divided to sports in general, but also there are now their own reporter teams for Borussia and Fortuna, and they are only covering exclusive stories on those both teams, and only subscription articles, so that we specifically cater to those user groups that are interested in those football teams. And they get their own Instagram. Channels where they spread those articles, and this is just an example how listening to our readers through data did not only lead to a different way to produce articles, but it also drastically changes the way we produce articles and work in teams. And I think the more data we're gonna gather, the more of those changes will occur in the future, that we more and more work just towards our readers and not how we thought that journalism was made before.
Hannah, and guten Morgen. So yes, we have some questions here, and we have one here from Lee Zejong that also somebody else want to know the answer. And this is the question: does the dashboard search websites only, or it can search through social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram?
Well, this is based on the API from the social media, what kind of data we get, but in general, it searches everything that's online. So other websites, but also social media, Twitter and Instagram. But for example, in Facebook, we can only see public pages and verified users. Obviously, we can't see private posts. On Twitter, we can see public tweets as well. So it's basically everything apart from the stuff that's private, really.
We have here another question from Claire Krautren. So, congrats on finding stories ahead of the crowd. Your Yang Yang article makes me wonder if you regularly publish articles in English. Do you think that could help with community building?
Yeah, that was actually a thought that we had before, if it would pay out to translate articles. But so far, translating everything in a way that's really high quality would be a lot more expensive than it pays out. But we thought that we could maybe pick out specific target groups, like, for example, Japanese people living in Düsseldorf, because there's a big Japanese community, and have different languages for them. So like smaller target groups, and maybe have newsletters for them. So this is something we're thinking about just now, yeah. But we see in our dashboard, when someone uses the Google Translate add-on, then we see the translated headline. So sometimes it's actually quite interesting to see what kind of languages the article is read in. Yeah.
Interesting. So we have here another question from Stella Folkenen. And she asked, what was the biggest surprise challenge you had when setting up the subscription project team? Was there something you didn't expect, good or bad?
I think it was, as I said, about sports. We didn't think that, people were only interested in those specific teams, and that sports in general, it is still a big reach, source of reach. But when it comes to subscriptions, people didn't really care about that. That was a big surprise. And also, which was a really good surprise, I think, was that people are actually willing to pay for really political stuff, to pay for political analysis, for comments from our editors. And we wasn't too sure about that, but now our numbers have shown that this is actually something that people are interested in, which I think is a really good thing to know.
Great. And we have time for one last question, Hannah. This comes from Laura Oliver. And Laura says, I'm really interested in how you've built the bridge between the raw results from the listening tool and turning those into something useful for journalists and the newsroom. How do you go about this?
That was actually quite a challenge, because we had those hundreds and hundreds of mentions, and obviously you can't read all of them, especially with local editors who get so much email every day that they can't be bothered reading all those mentions. And in the beginning, we thought doing those really quantitative analysis would be interesting for them, but that actually wasn't. So what we just did was have different ways of showing those mentions. So we had a section where you could see the really viral ones, but also to see just the newest ones, which was also really helpful, because sometimes just one tweet from one person might be a really good hint for a good article. So something actually doesn't have to go viral to be a story. And so what also helped us with setting us up was that in the beginning, when we introduced the tool, we went to every local office and would just sit there, like one person would sit there for a week and hand in the reportings themselves. And so we would get direct feedback on which stories were actually covered, so that the editors could just tell us, oh yeah, this was really helpful, or this wasn't so helpful. And I think this is something that is really this is different for every office, because sometimes for example, the police, they do really good press work, so they don't really need a lot of police tweets. In some other areas, they don't. So that's why from office to office, we actually changed the way we displayed those mentions based on their needs. And I think just taking a lot of time to introduce the reportings was a big help with that.
Okay, Hannah, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here today at Nice Audience, and hope to see you soon.
That was really interesting, Hannah, very insightful. We had a lot of questions about content in different languages. That's why we also we like to feature media organizations from different countries at the summit, precisely to talk about these things. So I believe the audience got some answers there. Thank you so much